So at this point, I would turn it over to Katie, who will introduce our speakers for today, and thank you for attending. Katie?
Thanks. Thank you, Tommy. I'm happy to be here to moderate today's discussion. I want to kick things off by introducing today's speakers. As Tommy said, I'm Katie Goen, and I'm a marketing manager at Alert Media. And our first guest today is Chris Schlagg. Chris is attorney at law at Jackson Lewis PC. Her practice focuses on environmental health and safety matters involving legal and regulatory compliance, as well as federal and state government enforcement actions. Chris anticipates compliance challenges and then provides employers with astute guidance on how to comply with laws, improve health and safety programs, as well as defend against federal and state enforcement initiatives and actions. Hi, Chris. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, hi, Katie.
I'd also like to introduce Peter Steinfeld. Peter has been involved in the emergency communications industry for more than 20 years. He's the Senior Vice President of Safety Solutions at Alert Media, where he works closely with a wide range of organizations to support their employee safety, business continuity, and emergency preparedness initiatives. Peter previously held leadership roles at Symantec and Dell, among several other enterprise software companies. Hi, Peter. Welcome.
Hello. Thanks so much. Glad to be here.
We are certainly glad to have you. Well, I just want to take a minute to discuss today's agenda. We'll be going over the current state of reopening, including how the pandemic is impacting reopening plans. We're also going to dive into some examples of how some major organizations are handling their return to the workplace. We'll talk about how to address and comply with regulation changes, as well as prioritize any conflicting advice from government agencies. We'll discuss key considerations for adjusting your safety policies and procedures, along with some tips for developing a vaccine policy. And finally, best practices for communicating your reopening plan to your employees and stakeholders. But before we dive into all that, I would like to take a minute to poll our attendees today. This is just going to give us a better understanding of where our audience currently stands with their plans to return to the workplace. So if you could take just a moment to fill out the question on your screen, which is, when does your company plan to return to the workplace? 0 to 3 months, 3 to 6 months, 6 to 12 months, more than 12 months, or already returned? So I'll give everybody just another minute. I see we have a few responses coming in. And I'll end this poll, and then I'll go ahead and share the results with everyone, just so we can all get the results and feedback here. All right. Okay, so it looks like about 40% of folks are either at the 0 to 3 or 3 to 6 month mark. Some folks are looking at 6 to 12 months, very few 12 or more, and then about 13% already returned. So let me go to you on this, Chris. Is this about what you were expecting based on what you're seeing and hearing out there?
Yeah, I would say it's pretty consistent. We see a lot of employers that are accelerating their plans. Some of them were shooting for a June date, but as vaccines have rolled out, they're feeling a little more comfortable with planning their return to work. And so a lot of folks are starting to reopen now, which is kind of great. It's nice to see life returning to normal. So.
Absolutely. And what about you, Peter? Anything unexpected here?
No, if you had asked me this about 2 to 3 weeks ago, I would have said it's probably like the 3 to 6, 6 to 12, but I had a feeling it would have shifted up to that 0 to 3, 3 to 6 range, because especially not just the vaccines, but the changes to the mask rules.
Sure, that makes sense.
Yeah.
All righty. Well, we'll kick things off now by, I'll hand it over to Peter, who's going to discuss the current state of reopening.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. So as Katie mentioned, the current phase of the pandemic is a huge consideration for organizations as they develop their plan to return to the workplace. And with that comes navigating what I would say is really a wide variety of issues, such as things like logistical factors, financial and operational challenges, and employee health and safety concerns. Unfortunately, pandemic circumstances continue to change frequently, sometimes daily, or as Chris would say, sometimes every hour. And she'll talk more about that soon. For example, just last week, the CDC announced that fully vaccinated individuals don't need to wear masks or practice social distancing in order to be safe. Just a few days before that, vaccines became available to anyone over the age of 12. At this point, it's really a good idea to routinely check the news headlines and various agency websites to stay current on the latest pandemic info. Now, in terms of vaccine status, as of mid-May, these are the latest numbers as of then, 37% of all Americans are now fully vaccinated, and more than 47% have received at least one dose, and that's across all age groups. So this is really good news for businesses across the country that have been waiting for a majority of their workers to be vaccinated before returning to the office. Even though change is constant in this current phase of the pandemic, things do appear pretty promising, which means the how and the why of reopening are really top of mind for many companies. So with all this change, the most common question people seem to have is around the timing of return. When are companies planning to return workers to the office? Well, we just saw our own little mini poll we did there, but to get an idea of the answer on a broader scale, the Institute of Corporate Productivity recently queried, it was a little over 400 business professionals in their monthly Get Employees Vaccinated survey, that's what they call it. And in late April 2021, so this is before the mask mandate changes came out, they found among those surveyed that 21% of US-based employers have already returned their workers to the office. About 6% are beginning the transition now. 26% are planning their return to the workplace this summer or early fall. And then the remainder are waiting just another 6 months, haven't decided yet, or fall into that other category. So these results aren't surprising considering the statistics that we just discussed a second ago on the flu vaccine. And I'm fairly certain that the 26% number of those planning to return in early summer or fall just increased quite a bit with the recent changes to the mask guidelines. And I think we saw that with the mini poll we did here. So now, as companies cautiously approach their pathway forward, one other point to consider is that adding to the complexity of the overall decision process are all the employees voicing their individual opinions about returning to the workplace. And those opinions vary based on things like age, region of the country or world, health, political preferences, and of course, personal circumstances. So you got to contend with that as well. Now, regardless of the current pandemic phase or conflicting employee preferences about reopening, employers have to continue to fulfill their duty of care, which is their moral and legal responsibility to keep their employees safe. Reopening can, and I think will, be very complicated, but in order to fulfill that duty of care, businesses have to consider and prioritize certain factors, such as things like relaxed government restrictions surrounding capacity limits, sizes of gatherings, mask wearing, and social distancing. Agencies such as OSHA, HIPAA, the EPA, the CDC, and others, they're issuing new or updated guidelines and regulations. Vaccination status is very much a hot button topic right now. Companies are all contemplating if they should invite or require all employees to come back to the office or just those who are vaccinated. And if they're going to require the people to show some kind of proof of vaccination or just take their word for it. Finally, they have to consider revising company policies and procedures that reflect employee health and safety in general. So Chris is going to discuss these considerations in more detail later in the presentation, but it's important for organizations to recognize that their reopening plans should take lots of different factors into account, and then fulfilling duty of care should be a top priority. Now, as you contemplate your plan to return to the workplace, there are logistical questions that may arise. The biggest or most important decisions may be about the who and the when. So will you require all employees to come back to the office full-time or perhaps just a few days a week? Will you implement a hybrid plan where some workers are in the office and others remote? Will you need to do things like staggering shifts? And then how do you keep track of where all your employees are and when? How will you know who will be in the office for a meeting and who will be joining via Zoom or Teams or some kind of online meeting platform? Will it even matter if some people attend in person and others attend virtually? It's a big consideration there. If shifts are staggered, how do you know who's covering that shift any given time or on a particular day? And then other questions may arise about the company culture. How will your employees interact with each other? Will the reopening plan promote productivity, or there's going to be a challenge there? How will you balance that flexibility that your employees are used to if they've been working remotely over the past year or more. I was just on the phone with someone yesterday, and we were talking about how it's nice that you can just kind of, set up deliveries at home and things like that. And people become accustomed to that, and they're not going to be able to do that as easily anymore. If your employees collaborate, will they be able to do that efficiently and effectively? All good questions. So it's really critical for organizations to take a 100,000-foot view of all these logistics and consider the big comprehensive picture in order to reopen safely. And I think just as importantly, smoothly, without much impact to overall operations. Now, beyond logistics, there's no shortage of financial and operational considerations for organizations as they develop their ongoing reopening plans. In regards to facilities, you may have to decide whether or not to renew a lease on an office building, maybe alternate seating arrangements or desk configurations, undertake new or enhanced cleaning and sanitation practices, and then decide where to physically host meetings or larger group gatherings. I don't think a lot of people have worked that out yet. Many companies already have or will be implementing symptom screening stations or temperature checks before an employee enters the building. And these protocols may require new technology, hardware, software, and perhaps a person or several people to monitor or set them up. And then if your plan includes a hybrid model, your employees might need dual workstations, one at the office and one at their home. Or are they going to be responsible for transporting their equipment back and forth on a regular basis? And is that really reasonable? You got to think through all that. Work travel, it's another financial and operational consideration. Will the cadence of work trips go back to pre-pandemic times, or is it going to be more reduced or limited in nature? With many industries and companies relying on remote meetings and becoming accustomed to them, I think that's a big part, for the past year or more, will work travel even be necessary? So an organization's reopening plan should certainly allow for all these financial and operational impacts and considerations I just talked about. But businesses should also not overlook factors concerning employee retention and well-being. In fact, I would say they should be very much a top priority. Leadership should certainly ask their workers about their preferences or even their specific circumstances that may affect whether or not they come back to the office. This can include things like, what do employees want or need from their employer in order to feel supported and be successful in their job on an ongoing basis? Do they have available and affordable childcare, elder care, or other dependent care? A lot of folks started doing that as they were working from home, and they won't be able to anymore if they've got to go to the office full-time or part-time. Do they have a car or access to another reliable mode of transportation? The finances and logistics of a lot of different households changed quite a bit since the pandemic began. So employers should not assume that the personal circumstances of each and every employee is exactly the same as it was pre-pandemic. Will a return to the workplace negatively affect the mental health of your workers? Something to consider. Will you offer any new resources or support that can help them through the transition and beyond? I'd say that employers should be very deliberate, mindful, and considerate of how their reopening plans impact each and every one of their employees and afford everyone just a little bit of flexibility and adjustment time. It's not just an on or off switch that you can throw. Now, to help put this in context, let's look at what some other major organizations out there are doing for their reopening plans. So this is all publicly available information that we were able to gather. We've got no inside sources here that are private that we're revealing. But Salesforce has introduced a unique phased approach. This month, they're introducing a program called Volunteer Vaccinated Cohorts. And that's at their Salesforce Tower in San Francisco, where fully vaccinated employees will be able to volunteer to return to the office. Next will be the phased reopening stage, when offices will essentially gradually reopen from 20% to 75% capacity. And then in the third stage, it'll be a full office reopening. IBM, they've unveiled how they plan to shift from remote work to a hybrid model. That was their choice. They're launching a reorientation program for employees that return to the office. And they expect that roughly 80% of workers will mix in-office and remote work going forward. That's a pretty big number. Walmart, they are going to start bringing workers back to their Bentonville office campus no earlier than July. And they've stated that their global technology employees will continue to work virtually long-term. Ford Motor Company, they're going to transition to a flexible hybrid work model in July at their main campus in Dearborn. And the company plans to let people stay home for focused work. We're hearing that a lot. And then come into the office for activities requiring teamwork. So focused versus teamwork is a big thing to think about. And then lastly here, Jpmorgan Chase is the first top tier US bank to require all employees to return to their offices by July and then maintain a consistent rotational schedule. So for whatever it is, come back to the office, but maintain it consistently. Don't kind of be haphazard all over the place. All right, next, Chris is going to walk us through some tips and on basically how to address and comply with regulation changes and key considerations for developing new safety policies. Chris, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. First of all, I just want to say, I like how you called it haphazardly, with your schedule, maintaining it outside of the workplace. Employers have a lot to think about these days, and kind of how to balance those operational issues among the competing regulatory challenges is one of those things they have to think about. And so what I'm going to talk about is just an overview today. We do not have enough time to delve into the crazy nitty-gritty land of COVID regulations. So I'll give a high-level overview, give you some things to think about, and then I'll point out some issues where it'd definitely be helpful for you to sync up either with your own legal counsel. You can also sync up with me offline. I'm happy to do that. But just as a starting framework, COVID issues are subject to a variety of environmental health and safety, and they're in a layered approach. There's some federal environmental health and safety laws, there's some state environmental health and safety laws, and then there's even some local fund orders that impact COVID in the office, or COVID concerns in the office. And the way I like to think about it is, you kind of have the public health issue, which is driven by CDC guidance and kind of how are we addressing COVID in the public health space. And then separately, apart from CDC guidance, you have all of those fun agencies like OSHA and EPA, OSHA, the state agencies that are kind of driving the state health and safety regulations. So employers, when they're looking at their reopening plans and figuring out what they need to do, they can't simply look at CDC guidance, because CDC guidance doesn't tell the whole story. They also need to look at, where their locations are at, if there's a specific state statute or state regulation that applies. And I'll give you just some examples. If you're in New York, for example, you're going to be subject to the HERO Act, which just came out, and you've got OSHA stuff to contend with. So you've got some interesting layered health and safety requirements there. And basically, it pushes employers to developing a COVID prevention program and plan as part of their return to work process. Similarly, in California, you've got an emergency temporary standard. The emergency temporary standard is actually being considered for review by the standards board today as we speak, which means there might be some exciting hot topics coming out later today or even tomorrow about some changes and requirements in California. But in addition to those fun things, you also have to be aware of local orders. So there may be some health department orders, some health officer orders that impact your business based off of location. And there may be specific restrictions that you need to incorporate into your plan as well. So along with those fun laws, what you have to comply with, you also have to deal with kind of some increased inspections, investigations. COVID is a really hot topic. It's also one that everybody's kind of tired of talking about, but it's also one that's very politically focused right now. You have a lot of agency activities around it. OSHA announced a national emphasis program on COVID issues. And you have a lot of state safety agencies that are also putting COVID issues at the forefront of their enforcement initiatives. So that means as employers are reopening, they might be dealing with some agencies that they've never dealt with before, especially if you're in a primarily an office setting where you don't have a ton of hazards. You might never have interacted with OSHA before, or even thought about what your OSHA compliance needed to look like because you were such a low hazard type of environment. But now you've got COVID concerns. There's a huge potential for COVID complaints and COVID investigations. And because it's an enforcement initiative, you're much more likely to see an inspector or hear somebody respond to those types of complaints than if it was just a general office safety concern. And then some of the things that employers are doing to address COVID are also adding to their compliance obligations, which are also raising some interesting government agency action. So one of the things that you mentioned, Peter, earlier is that employers are going to have to think about their cleaning and disinfection protocols. Well, cleaning and disinfection activities often involve use of hazardous chemicals. And so employers that maybe were never having to deal with hazardous chemical safety rules or compliance obligations now have those compliance obligations as a result of their new cleaning and disinfection tasks. So employers will have to be aware of all of those things. And one of the things that they can do to minimize risk and to deal with some of those legal issues is, as you're developing your return to work plan, really think about what new activities, what new procedures you're going to have. Do a hazard assessment. That's a really fancy way of saying you're going to do an assessment of your actual activities to see if you have any new or different hazards that are being introduced and what specific controls you should implement to kind of deal with those potential hazards. So if you've got new cleaning and disinfection tasks, you may need to introduce some new procedures for managing the cleaning and disinfection. If you have different procedures for in the workplace, then you would also have to that out in your return to work or COVID prevention. So Katie, I'm going to have you flip to the next slide. All right, so all of that I just explained to you should have given you a signal that there's a possibility you're going to run into some, different opinions on what sort of requirements you need to comply with in the workspace. And the short answer is you are going to run into a lot of information. It may be conflicting from federal agencies. For example, there's right now a conflict between federal OSHA and CDC in terms of what employers are expected to do with respect to vaccinated people. CDC guidance says that fully vaccinated individuals do not need to wear masks or socially distance, but federal OSHA has guidance out that says individuals in the workplace and employers generally should require that their employees follow all preventative measures without regard for whether they're vaccinated or not vaccinated, meaning that there really isn't a way to relax those social distancing or face mask requirements at this time. Now, they do have a banner up on their website that says that they're gonna, vet CDC guidance and release something soon, but until then, there's a little bit of a conflict there for employers, and they're going to have to grapple with that. There's also conflicts between state laws. So I can give you a fun example because I'm in Texas, and Texas, is pretty ready to be done with this whole COVID thing and has relaxed a lot of their measures. And Tommy, though, is in California, and I bet you if you ask Tommy, he would tell you that they are not ready to relax their COVID measures. So it's a very different environment. And that means you will have to pay attention to which state you're in, what the different local considerations are. And then you'll want to make sure you have clear and consistent communication to your employees about what specific preventative measures you're implementing and why. I think it's best if you can implement a policy that contemplates the science, that's consistent with all of the state and local laws as much as you can, because that helps ensure consistent messaging with employees, but recognizing that you may have to have some different preventative measures in different locations as a result of different state and local laws. So Peter, I don't know, it looked like you might be ready to say something on the edge of your seat. So I'm just gonna pause and see if that's actually the case. Or
No. I'm actually just listening very intently. I'm thinking
Okay.
all sorts of things are going through my head.
All right, great. Well, so I'm gonna have us flip to the next slide, Katie. All right. So the one thing that I get asked a lot about, and I think the thing that employers are considering the most right now, and it's such a hot topic, is what to do about vaccines and if they should have a vaccination policy. And I think on the heels of CDC guidance, employers have largely thought, oh, if I have a vaccination policy or I'm checking vaccination status for my employees, then I can relax some of the preventative measures. And as I mentioned to you, CDC guidance applies in the public health space, not the workspace. So employers do need to follow the laws for their workspaces, and there may be either they're subject to federal OSHA jurisdiction or a state safety agency or specific state emergency temporary standards or health orders, one of those things. They need to check all of those things. But for the time being, there isn't a strong argument on the safety side that you can fully relax your preventative measures on the basis of vaccination alone. So employers should consider that as part of their analysis of whether a vaccine policy is actually needed. And then, vaccine policies, just as at a high level, they create a lot of different risks and potential liabilities for employers. So employers should definitely consult with an attorney or any legal counsel before implementing and rolling them out, just because of the many different legal risks and liabilities with these policies. But then finally, this is a really gray area of law right now. I'll just tell you, there's new stuff coming out about this daily, hourly. Yesterday, there were not hardly any orders that addressed vaccines, but then just this week, we've started to see different state and local counties issuing orders requiring vaccination checks before individuals entered a work site. So you may actually have a local order from a health department that's telling you you have to check somebody's vaccine status before they can come into your workplace. We've also seen some emerging bills and legislation where maybe geographically there's a different preference. For example, in Utah, there's a bill right now where it is preventing employers, or it proposes a law that would prevent employers from asking about vaccination status, or finding out information about if employees have obtained vaccines, or if they can provide proof of vaccination status. So it's just a really gray area. It's constantly changing. We're expecting it to continue to be in flux. That said, there is EEOC guidance that says employers can generally have vaccine programs. They can require vaccinations in some contexts, provided it's tied to a job-related business necessity, and that they do have some consideration for accommodations for religious, medical, personal, or other reasons for why somebody cannot get vaccinated. So just a whole ton of things for employers to think about. And you should think about all of these things as part of your return to work plan and kind of figuring out, do you need to have a policy? Do you need to have a policy because of the safety preventive measures that you're implementing in response to COVID? How are you going to structure it? And then separately, how are you going to communicate it to employees? And recognize that you may need to have a pretty much continual dialogue with your employees about what's going on, because this is in such flux that you might decide today that you're going to do something and tomorrow have to change it because of a changing law or a changing requirement.
Chris, can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
So I know it's difficult to prognosticate, but do you think things will continue to get more complicated as individual states put up more rules around this, and it won't be at the federal level?
Yeah, I do actually think it will get more complicated, because another interesting fun wrinkle, and I hope you guys don't mind, but I'm going to geek out here for just 2 seconds. But basically, the reason why employers are able to push for vaccination information, require vaccination, and even ask for proof of vaccination at this point is because of COVID being a direct threat and us being in a pandemic situation. The second we're out of a pandemic situation and we're kind of returned to normal and we no longer consider COVID to be the threat that it's been. In other words, the risk of exposure to COVID and the potential threat that it presents today is not the same potential threat that it presented a year ago. And that changes the game in terms of whether you actually have a job-related business necessity for requiring vaccines, or even asking your employees about vaccines. And it does raise a question about whether employers have a legitimate reason for asking about vaccination status, having a vaccine program, or even collecting information about whether their employees are vaccinated or not. So it's a really interesting landscape of legal issues, and it's definitely going to continue to change because we have changing circumstances from COVID daily. And once we're out of that pandemic, it does kind of change what the risks are for employers, and the necessity for employers to require vaccines. And I can tell you, historically, how we've dealt with vaccines for other types of communicable diseases is that even if you have an occupational exposure risk, meaning you're, say, for example, in the healthcare environment and you're working with individuals who might be infected with a communicable disease, usually the laws have said, hey, you employer are able to provide vaccines and you can require them in these circumstances, but if an employee needs an accommodation, you can provide that, and they just sign a declination waiver saying I've been provided the vaccine or I have access to the vaccine and I personally am not getting it. And so we do have kind of this, historical moment where we're trying to figure out how we're going to deal with this type of public health and crossover workplace safety issue. But most employers are not going to be on strong legal footing with vaccine programs or mandated vaccine programs, absent a law requiring them to check for vaccination status or an occupational exposure risk, which many employers will not have just because of how the vaccine law has been in the past. So yes, I think it's going to constantly change. And if you ask me the question again in 2 months, I will probably have an entirely different answer for you.
Very good.
Yeah. So shifting away from just the idea of vaccines, and just at a high level, as employers are returning to work, I think it should be recognized that there's a new normal and there's new policies and new things to think about. In addition to the safety policies that employers need to think about, they need to think about sick leave policies. And I think Peter and I maybe even talked about this on our podcast a while back, but the situation where people were coming to work sick and sneezing and coughing all over people, and then, you just kind of grinned and bared it and just, you might be dying, but you were in the office that day. That type of, accepted practice is kind of gone. Like at this point, people don't want sick colleagues in their workspace, and that might mean that you need to make an adjustment to your sick leave policies, increase your sick days, or even change your remote work policies so that there is that flexibility for people to not be coming in the workspace when they're sick. We don't want them in the workspace when they might have COVID symptoms, and we don't want them when they're going to have symptoms of other types of illness. I think you'll see a shift in employers offering different types of health policies in addition to those safety policies. There's a lot of things to think about there in terms of your benefits package, how you want to set them up. There are different laws that govern all of those areas. So again, those are things you'd want to consult with legal counsel about, especially if you're in California, California special. So just sorry, Tommy, I know we're bashing on your state, but you're really just gonna want to consult with an attorney that practices there because of the unique issues and how many different state bills and legislation have come out about COVID policies in general. And then with that, I would say we're seeing a shift towards a focus on wellness programs. And I think that's a huge thing for employers to consider to be a new normal. Is, we need employers and employees benefit from employers having wellness programs, for putting wellness at the forefront of, day in, day out type of things, checking in on their health and safety, but also checking in to make sure that they're thriving in the work environment. And that may mean having some different types of health clinics. It may mean having some different vaccination offerings, some different, testing strategies. Although I'll just make a caveat there that the workplace testing strategies are also subject to change with legal issues and, rapidly changing EEOC guidance. So that's another area where you would want to chat with an attorney as part of your, development of those strategies. But yes, lots of new policies to think about, and the new normal may be very different than what it was when we went in the shutdowns last year, and your culture may feel very different as you're returning to work. All right, so I want to just hit some things. I've been working with employers on reopening since the shutdown last year. So I've seen a lot of best practices, and I've seen a lot of things that have maybe not gone over as smoothly as possible. So the one thing I can recommend is that you really do an assessment of your operations, of what has changed, what's different, and where you need to put new policies or procedures in place. And don't just rely on word of mouth communication about those new policies and procedures. Make sure they're documented, and that communication is rolled out to your employees. And then secondly, I'll tell you, employees have a lot of stress. This is just 2020, 2021 have been very stressful years. And so recognizing that the more lead time you can give them on the expected practices or how things are going to change, and just, the more upfront dialogue and transparent dialogue you can have with them, the better, because then they'll feel more comfortable with what you're doing. I actually read an article the other day that was, it was talking about how a researcher had gone out and spoke with employees about how they felt about the return to work and their employer's return to work plans. And they said most employees felt like their employer did not have a good handle on the return to work plan, or wasn't communicating it, or it just kind of came out of left field that, all right, now we're going to return to the office and it has to happen in the next 2 weeks. And then, they just kind of found out about the policies and procedures that would be in place the day before they went back to the office or something like that. And that doesn't make anyone feel good. So I would give yourself enough time, make sure you can clearly communicate and give that warning to employees. And then lastly, I would say, really vet your policies and procedures with legal counsel. There are so many gray areas right now on the policies and procedures. It's like an onion, the different layers of legal requirements that are on employers in the COVID issues. And so it's something employers really need to vet before they roll out. And then be flexible, because as Katie mentioned earlier, some of the stuff is changing hourly, and you might think you have a really good plan, and then somebody issues a guidance document that completely changes your entire viewpoint, and you have to pivot. And in that situation, having transparency with employees would be ideal, so you can make sure they're aware of why the change is necessary. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Peter.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chris. I'll just finish up with a few slides here. And what I'd like to focus on now, based on what you said, is how to efficiently and effectively communicate your reopening plan to your employees and other stakeholders. As you develop your communication strategies, as Chris said, transparency is really vital in helping your people feel supported and really just overall safe as they transition back to in-person work. Once your reopening plan is fully documented, be sure to share it openly with your employees across multiple channels. Really get the information in front of them however you can in order to ensure that it is consumed. And that's the key part. Make sure people are reading it and consuming it. And then give them the why. That's really important. If your people are aware of your rationale for developing or modifying a policy, they're usually more willing to get on board. It's also recommended that you implement a method of soliciting employee feedback. That way they'll feel like the communication really is a two-way street and that they're being heard. Big part of it. Another good idea is to implement a transition team. More specifically, this team is essentially a group of designated employees across the business who each assess and manage any communication or execution challenges in general. These transition teams can work with executive leadership to do things like problem solve, address challenges, and then communicate solutions back to the broader audience of employees. Rightly so, this is a very confusing time, and I can't emphasize enough the importance of rapid and consistent communication to avoid, or maybe just at least ameliorate, the hits to productivity that are caused by such confusion. The transition team and their communications can also help ensure that your people know the organization is really genuinely concerned for their safety and that your communications are not just some kind of formality. And then next, definitely take advantage of the benefits offered by a modern mass communication software solution, such as the one we provide here at Alert Media. A system like this can help you quickly and easily communicate with your employees about the return to the workplace, as well as issue real-time updates if, or should I say when, based on our discussion, your plan changes. You can take advantage of two-way messaging capability, which I think is really key to confirming employee safety and well-being instantly. Two-way messaging also gives employees a way to request help or provide pivotal information about them on their status. Multi-channel notifications increase message visibility because things can oftentimes get lost or ignored in a single channel, like email. So definitely add other channels into the mix, like voice calls, text messages, mobile app pushes, desktop takeover, what pops up on their screen and they can't avoid it, integration with tools like Schlagg and others. You can reach employees wherever they are, not just physically, that's important, but also digitally, because people are in different spots. Our clients here at Alert Media have access to lots of free templates that we provide them to help them craft the perfect message or alert for a ton of different situations. And then things like our event pages help them further organize communications and keep all messages updated related to a particular situation in one centralized place. You can even notify people about potential COVID exposures, which is not just a good thing to do morally, but some states require it by law. And then another helpful tool you can take advantage of with our solution specifically is things like surveys. So survey functionality allows you to streamline and document the process for wellness checks. We do one here at our company every day for folks coming back in the office. You can also do things like track vaccination status, gauge employee vaccination concerns, perform things like pre-work symptom checks, assess employee willingness to return to the office, request feedback on reopening plans, and then issue surveys to monitor who's in the office, which can definitely be helpful later for contract tracing and stuff like that. Survey responses can absolutely help you identify employees that need additional support and then make it easy for you to follow up appropriately. And then now, after your surveys are sent out, you can receive instant feedback and pinpoint safety risks or individuals that might need additional help or assistance. And then real-time performance dashboards enable you to confirm message delivery, see things like read confirmations. I know I sent it, but did people actually read it? Is a human consuming that message, not just their device, or survey responses. And then you can extract detailed reports for user insights and event summaries later on. In my opinion, I think reporting capabilities are essential and really fundamental to providing follow-through on your overall reopening plan and ensuring your employees are well informed. That's the key part. You can't simply assume people are paying attention. You have to verify. Trust, but verify. One of our customers, JMI Equity, they made Alert Media a central part of their reopening strategy. And I'll ask permission. Katie, do we have time to go over that real quick, or should we switch over to the Q&A session? I want to make sure we have at least 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, just give a quick overview of JMI and then we'll switch over.
Okay, well, great. So they wanted to proactively plan for a phased, safe approach to returning to offices, and they leveraged our platform to help safely reopen for those who wish to return. It wasn't a forced thing. But what they did was they sent a survey to employees to assess their attitudes and viewpoints about returning to the office. And then all responses they got were very quickly and easily accessible and viewable from our dashboard via the web or the mobile app. And this enabled the company to essentially proactively follow up with employees as appropriate based on their responses. Once some employees had returned to the office, JMI conducted mandatory employee health screenings prior to the start of each workday, just automated it every day. They send it out and they get those responses back in real time. So what this did was it enabled them to comply with all the local reopening guidelines and then provide employees access to the office in a very responsible way. And that's the key. So as a result, they were able to effectively boost employee morale, promote safety, enable a seamless continuity of operations, so there's no disruption in that shift back to the office, and then provide visibility during the reopening. And that's all by leveraging an emergency communication solution. So that's all I had. Hope all the information we covered is going to help you identify the key challenges and priorities for your company as you guys decide the best reopening strategy for your business and employees. So at this point, I'll turn it back over to Katie and see if we have questions that we can take.
Yes, thank you so much, Peter. So before we do address those questions, I just want to launch one final poll here. If everyone could just take a quick moment to let us know if you're interested in learning more about how alert media can help with your return to the workplace. So I'll just ask you guys to get those responses in as soon as you can, and then we're going to get to some great questions from our audience here in just a moment. Okay, perfect. So if you have not already submitted a question into the Q&A box, you can do so now. And if for some reason we do not get to your question, we will follow up with you afterwards to make sure that you have all the information that you need. So the first thing, Chris, this is for you. Someone would like to know if you have any thoughts on nonprofit strategy and vaccine policies specifically.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think, you know, just something for this person to think about is that nonprofits, depending on the type of work that they're doing, they may have work more closely with the public. They may be working with specific vulnerable populations. And in some cases, like social workers, they can be subject to specific state and local guidance around vaccination policies and vaccination programs. And so nonprofits can oftentimes partner with the state and local agencies to either get vaccinations for their folks or kind of set up a vaccination program without actually having the full policy internally. So that might be an option for them. I would say that a lot of employers and many nonprofits do not fully need a vaccination policy. And the reason for that is they're not going to have an occupational exposure to COVID because of the type of work that they're doing. And so they might want to set up a program that's part of a wellness program rather than a mandatory policy or some sort of voluntary policy where they're tracking or kind of managing that vaccination information internally. But that's a great question for them to vet in, you know, along with the state and local guidelines that apply to their business, and then also review with legal counsel before implementation.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question for you, Chris. Is it best to not keep a copy of employees' vaccination cards?
Yeah, so this is a challenging question and it's a really murky answer, and I'm going to be such a lawyer here and tell you that it depends. And so I apologize for that answer, but here's kind of the issue. Vaccination records and those vaccination cards can, in some circumstances, be considered an employee record. And an employee medical record, when you collect them and when you keep them, they are subject to a 30-year retention requirement under federal OSHA and state equivalent health and safety regulations. So it puts a really substantial compliance burden on employers. And it also is something that they have to keep in a confidential file, part of the individual's medical file, and make to other people. So it can be a challenge to collect those and keep those, and may not be worth the actual benefit of having that information, especially if you don't have an occupational exposure to COVID. So, so something employers want to look at, and yeah, it's a depends, and there's no necessarily clear answer at this point in time.
Thank you for that. One for you, Peter. You mentioned that we should implement a way to solicit employee feedback on our reopening plan. Can you give some examples of what that could look like?
Yeah, I think it's just to get a sense of how many people in the company want to go back to the office, either full-time or maybe part-time or not at all. I'll be frank, I was a little bit erring on the side of thinking everybody wanted to come back to the office. But when we did our survey several months ago, we found out that that was actually not the case. So there was a good amount of people that said, no, I'm pretty comfortable working from home. And then a large majority in the middle that said they would love the hybrid model, where they just come to the office 2, maybe 3 days a week. I thought for sure everyone was like me and they couldn't wait to get back full time. So I think it will really open your eyes by asking people and realizing that not everyone's the same, and it can help change management's viewpoint on what perhaps should be the new normal going forward. So that's the biggest part of it right there, is just not being biased by what's in your own mind and really getting input and understanding holistically what do people in general feel like.
If I could just add to that, Peter, I think where I've seen employers hit some pitfalls is not engaging in that employee discussion, and then management and employees not being on the same page at all about kind of what the workplace is going to look like after the new normal hits. And then you have a ton of employee dissatisfaction about the situation. They don't necessarily feel engaged or that they've been heard or listened to about their situation. And we've seen it result into, some substantial turnover for some employers as they're kind of moving back to their normal operations. Then they have to contend with hiring a bunch of new folks, onboarding them, and it could have potentially been avoided just by having that dialogue about what's going to work for everybody.
Yeah, better to know in advance if it's different than what you thought than implementing something and then have it come bite you on the back end.
Chris, is simply having a knowledge of the vaccination status of employees considered a personal medical record and create risks for the organization? You touched on that kind of a little bit, but maybe some confusion there.
So I think I know I'm going to give you guys another fun lawyer answer. But so the thing is, it really depends on what specific information you've collected about the vaccination status, what format that was collected in. And it's such a factual intensive inquiry as to whether or not you've got a medical record or if you've just got a record of some sort of information. But that is personal information for the employee, no matter how you spin it. And so you do need to be cautious about how you share or transmit that information, especially if you're in certain states like, California, because how you share information that you've collected about employees can result in potential liability under the state's privacy laws. So it's a really fact-intensive inquiry, and it's just something that employers need to vet as part of their plans on whether to have a vaccine policy or not. And so some questions that employers should think about are, should they have a vaccine policy? If they do, how are they going to set it up? If they set it up, how are they collecting that information? If they collect the information, what format is it in? Where is it being stored? And then who's going to be responsible for keeping that information secure? So lots of different factors, and it's just a very fact-intensive inquiry.
Gotcha. Okay. Sorry, Peter, another question for Chris.
No, please. She's much more interesting than I am on this topic.
And I also want to say we have quite a few questions about whether or not we're going to share the slides in the webinar. We absolutely are. So afterwards, everyone will be emailed the full webinar to view. Okay, so Chris, back to you. What happens when you get employee input on returning to the office, but everyone's feedback is different? Employers can't make everyone happy. So how do you suggest we handle this fairly?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, I think you're absolutely right. You can't make everyone happy. We've encountered this at my own firm, Jackson Lewis. I'm one of those, holdouts, rebels that doesn't ever want to go back to the office because I don't like driving. But we have other people that, they can't function working at home for whatever reason. And it is a fine balancing act. And I think as long as you have heard and understand what differences there may be in employee situations and try to accommodate, even if it's something you can't, where it's something like you as a company have decided, we can't actually have a full hybrid approach, or we can't have full remote work anymore because of XYZ reasons, communicate that with employees and then see if there is potentially a workaround, recognizing you won't make everybody happy, but at least if you've heard and understand where certain people are coming from, maybe there is a small tweak that you can make that will address the situation and still, allow you to move forward with the policy that makes sense for the business.
And I always think it's like err on the side of productivity. If someone can be very productive where they are, then is there really a need to change? And if its productivity suffers, that's when you have to have an honest conversation with that person and say, look, it just doesn't work in the nature of what you're doing tied into the company. Another thing to think about is tenure. If you have very young workers, sometimes it's really hard for them to learn and grow if they're not around other people. Something to consider. Like I can't imagine starting in the workplace like I did when I was in my early 20s. If I were stuck at home in a small 1-bedroom apartment with no exposure to people that were vastly more experienced than I am, so think about that as well. Someone who's much more tenured, although you want them there exposing all their knowledge to the younger people, they can get away with working from home, whereas someone younger may not be able to. Just something to think about.
Excellent. Well, that is all the time that we have for questions today, but there were quite a few that we did not get to. So don't worry, guys, we will get you this information so that you get the answers that you're looking for.
We'll answer each question, right? And send those out to.
Yes. And some of them are very specific to their organizations as well. So we'll do our best to kind of decipher all of that.
Sure.
All right. Well, I just wanted to thank Chris and Peter for being with us today. Chris, if anyone has any questions for you after this or just wants to follow up, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn. They can find me there. I feel like I'm the only Chris Schlagg on LinkedIn, but there may be some other like snowboarder / comedian that's more interesting. You can reach out to that Chris too. They won't be sad about it. But you can find me on LinkedIn. You can also check out Jackson Lewis. We have a firm page. We also have a ton of COVID resources there. And our workplace health and safety team is also happy to answer questions. So any of those methods will work.
Perfect. How about you, Peter? How can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn's great as well. There's not a lot of Peter Steinfelds out there. Mine will be pretty obvious. Just look for the guy with the beard. I think there is a guy that works in Hollywood that produces movies who's also named Peter Steinfeld. That's not me. So don't reach out to him. And of course, you can always email me too at Alert Media. It's just my first initial and last name at alertmedia.com. So psteinfeld@alertmedia.com.
Wonderful. Well, I just want to take this last moment to thank all of our attendees who joined us today. We appreciate your participation in the discussion on how to navigate a safe and stable return to the workplace.